Serious and Organised Crime Policy Network, but I'm pleased to be chairing today in my advisory board capacity. As many of you also may know, HEUNI is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and it stays a bold frontrunner in creating and sharing uncompromised knowledge on the crime prevention and criminal justice. HEUNI engages policymakers, practitioners and researchers in frank discussions to tackle current problems and develops innovative solutions to advance the rights of those affected by crime. Considering the title of today's event, I can't promise that by the end of this event corruption will be measurable, but with our distinguished panel here today, I've no doubt that we'll certainly succeed in a frank discussion, and I'm confident we'll also be able to provide some innovative and action-oriented solutions. Not far off, almost 20 years ago now, Article 61 of UNCAC underscored the need to analyse trends in corruption and the circumstances in which corruption offences are committed. And since then, we've come a long way, gathering information on the structure and process of anti-corruption measures through the UNCAC review mechanism, and on the nature and extent of corruption through a wide range of statistical surveys, administrative data, indices and expert assessments. We continue to be plagued, though, by well-known problems of definitions, comparability of data across different contexts, challenges bringing different data types and sources together, the dark figure for administrative data, issues around reporting through surveys due to self-incrimination, understanding, embarrassment, and maybe even fear and intimidation. Our panelists today will unpack some of these challenges and provide us with new insights as to possible ways forward. We have 4 extremely distinguished panelists, and I'm really grateful to them for presenting their work today. Each panelist will have 10 minutes, and I'm afraid in order to leave some time for discussion, I'll be quite tight on the timing. Allow me then perhaps just to introduce our first panelist, Dr Natalia Ollus, the Director of HEUNI. Natalia holds a PhD in law and Masters in social anthropology. And in addition to her work at HEUNI, Natalia has held positions at UNODC, in South Africa, at the Permanent Mission of Finland to the UN in New York, and with OSCE in Vienna. Natalia's presentation title is How to Measure Structural and Unseen Forms of Corruption, Recent Indicators from Finland. Without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Natalia and look forward to her presentation. Many thanks. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for joining us at this very exciting event. We'll be going to the presentation, right, Alexandra? Yes, thank you. So my name is Natalia Ollus, as Stephen already introduced me, and I'd like to talk to you about a recent project we finalized in Finland, developing indicators on corruption suited for the Finnish context. Next slide, please. You are all familiar with the Corruption Perceptions Index, I'm sure, and as you probably know, Finland has usually fared very well in this measure. For the past years, Finland has been among the top countries on the Corruption Perceptions Index, with some changes over the years, but still Finland looking as a country relatively free from corruption. This was the backdrop for the development of measures to assess corruption in the Finnish context. How do you measure corruption in a country which, at least on the surface, looks to be quite little corrupt or not so corrupt? And the government in Finland was quite aware that there does exist forms of corruption in Finland, but how to measure this? Next slide, please. So the backdrop for our measures was, as I said, the Corruption Perceptions Index, which has perhaps also helped boost this nationally shared belief in Finland that we have no corruption, that this is a country free from corruption. And in a way, we all know that that is not true. We do have forms of corruption and especially unethical conduct that still exist in the country. But this shared belief that there is little corruption in the country has also, in a way, led to a situation where it has been difficult to identify and understand those forms of corruption and unethical conduct that do exist in the country. And then there was the understanding that we need indicators and most of all systematic measurement to understand these forms of corruption and unethical conduct. Research shows that corruption in Finland does exist in certain areas and certain sectors. for instance, in the financing of political parties and in the financing of political candidates, in urban planning, in kind of planning deals, and also in construction projects and in construction deals. And then we've had something which has been discussed quite a lot in the Finnish context, these so-called old boys clubs, which are in effect informal networks of people who know each other and who kind of make deals together, for instance, in the sector of, or in the construction sector or in urban planning. But this has also happened in politics, in business, and also in other forms of public procurement. And then we've also identified problems within the context of public procurement itself, where certain tenders are, for instance, suited to fit certain bidders. And this, of course, is very much related to these old boys clubs. Next slide, please. So the government noted that measurements on corruption should be developed in Finland. And in 2018, there was a tender put forward through the government's analysis, assessment, and research activities to develop indicators on 7 areas of corruption. On conflicts of interest and dual roles, on favoritism and on this kind of unethical assistance, kind of these old boys clubs, on informal decision-making, on undue influence in decision-making, on unethical restrictions in tender specifications, in election and in party funding, and then also the issue of match fixing, betting scandals, and bribery of referees. So this was a kind of a project that was put forward by the government and a consortium that consisted of the Police University College, ourselves at HEUNI, and then the University of Vaasa won this tender, and we implemented this project to develop indicators for measuring corruption in Finland over the past 2 years. Next slide, please. And to go to what we actually did. So we went through a whole set of literature. We looked at international examples, we looked at national examples, national studies, and so forth. And based on our research, we developed a set of indicators. The challenge we had was that how do you develop indicators that are actually going to be used and are going to be also realistic and perhaps cost efficient and most of all repeatable. So we focused on those 7 areas that I just mentioned, and we developed indicators based basically on existing surveys, existing measures, and existing kind of projects that are already being carried out. So as an example, and these are now again for the Finnish context, where the idea is that we, based on international measures, we are relatively free from corruption. So we decided to then suggest to the government these sets of indicators. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can find these in our publications, but just to mention some, on the issue on conflict of interest and dual roles, there is a certain survey to citizens on the ethics and morality of public servants. So we were able to pick an indicator assessing this element of corruption from this specific survey. We also piloted questions in the regularly repeated police barometer, which traditionally assesses the citizens' trust in the police. So we added a section on corruption specifically into this barometer, and this was piloted in 2020. So we included, for instance, a question on how serious do you think that the dual roles in public administration, how serious of a problem do you think this is in Finland? So this was tested in the police barometer and it worked reasonably well. And then there's also another survey which has been carried out in the country looking at corruption in the preparation of land use decisions and in kind of public planning. So this was used as an example of an indicator that we could use in the Finnish context and which could be repeated. And we then have similar kind of use of existing survey questions on the question of favoritism and also on informal decision-making outside formal decision-making structures, where we used questions from the Eurobarometer, which has had a specific barometer on corruption in the European Union. And we could go to the next slide, please. And then on these other dimensions that we looked at, similarly, we used existing survey questions to look at, for instance, whether there are unethical conducts in municipal decision-making, whether there is problems in public procurement, and then all the way to election and party funding, and then to betting scandals, bribery in sports, and competition manipulation. And as I said, you can see these questions in the document which we are publishing today as a policy paper, which is available in the chat function for you to read. Next slide, please. But as I said, this was only looking at these 7 dimensions of corruption commissioned in this study. But we felt as researchers that this doesn't necessarily give a very comprehensive measure of structural forms of corruption, as most of these forms of corruption identified in Finland are. So in order to really capture all these elements of corruption, we need additional data. Survey data is simply not enough. So we need qualitative data, specifically using qualitative interviews, for instance, focus group discussions, and also research based on media reports. And then we desperately need more research also based on how does the criminal justice system understand corruption? What is defined as corruption or unethical conduct? And how does it go forward in the criminal justice process? And what is the attrition of these cases? And then we obviously need threat and risk assessments. And then also, of course, what Finland, of course, is already doing, the assessment of compliance with existing international anti-corruption treaties. But we need, I think, a holistic approach to really be able to measure corruption. And I think most of all, this requires not just kind of the idea that we need to do this, but we also need resources and specific funding and a specific also mandate, I think, to do this, so that there are that it's systematically implemented over time and not just one-off studies. So I think this is something that I hope the other speakers will be addressing as well, how to ensure that we get a comprehensive approach towards measuring corruption, that it's not just one-off studies or simply only quantitative data on kind of one-dimensional elements of the problem of corruption. Next slide, please. That's all for my part, and I think I didn't use my entire allocated time, so I'm happy to give the floor to the next speaker. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for that fascinating presentation, highlighting both, I think, exactly how many sources we already have, but also how far we potentially still have to go as well. Thank you very much. What I suggest for questions and comments is that we listen to the 4 presentations, and then I'll invite questions in the chat at the end, which we'll then hopefully have some time to give to the panelists. I'll move to our next speaker, Mr. Matthew Moorhead. He's a legal advisor in the Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform at the Commonwealth Secretariat. The Commonwealth, of course, is a voluntary association of 54 independent and equal countries supported by the Secretariat to achieve its common goals. His presentation title is The Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmarks. The benchmarks are part of a series of key initiatives by the Commonwealth to strengthen anti-corruption measures in the member countries. I'm very much looking forward to learning about these. And Matt, you have the floor. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, HEUNI, for having me today. Congratulations on your 40th anniversary year. I'm really looking forward to collaborating more with you and learning more through your excellent research. And thank you, Stephen. I'm particularly delighted that Stephen is moderating this panel. In Stephen's previous role at the Commonwealth Secretariat, it was under his leadership that this project was designed and that the benchmarks got going. So it wouldn't have happened without you, Stephen. I'm really happy that you're here today so that we can discuss it with the panel. Could I have the next slide, please, Mina? So the Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmarks are a brand new publication and corruption fighting tool published in April 2021. They are a landmark publication of the Commonwealth Secretariat, produced in partnership with the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Centre and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. In brief, the benchmarks contain good practice anti-corruption measures. They are intended primarily to help governments and public sector organisations assess their anti-corruption laws, regulations, policies and procedures against international good practice and consider implementing appropriate improvements. The benchmark measures are designed to be achievable, practical and auditable. They provide a holistic and interlocking system that aims to reduce and deal with the risk of corruption in the public and private sectors. The benchmarks address corruption across key areas of the public and private sectors, which are either important for combating corruption or which are vulnerable to significant corruption. In relation to each key area, the benchmarks promote the concepts of honesty, impartiality, accountability, and transparency, and provide for specific anti-corruption measures. Could I have the next slide, please, Mina? A website where you can download the benchmarks from is displayed on this slide, but it's very easy to find them. If you Google Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Benchmarks, you will find them, and they are free to access and download. There's also other materials on that website that's listed on that slide there, including frequently asked questions to guide you through them. So who can benefit from the benchmarks? A government can assess whether its current laws, regulations, policies and procedures are consistent with the measures recommended in the benchmarks. If they are not, the relevant government can consider upgrading them so that they meet or exceed the benchmark standard. Similarly, a public sector body can review the sections of the benchmarks which are relevant to its activities and can measure and upgrade its policies and procedures accordingly. The contents of the benchmarks have been written in a clear and measurable manner so as to facilitate such review and implementation. The benchmarks have been written with sufficient clarity, detail, and supporting guidance that members of the public and non-government organisations can measure existing laws and regulations and public sector policies and procedures against the benchmarks and can call on governments for improvements. They thus facilitate the process of holding the government and the public sector to account against international good practice. As for the question whether the benchmarks are also relevant to the private sector, from an implementation perspective, the benchmarks are primarily applicable to government and the public sector. Those are our main intermediaries, the Commonwealth Secretariat. However, they also affect the private sector, as most of the recommended actions in the benchmarks will impact on the private sector. So some of the benchmarks apply equally to public and private sectors. Annex A to the guidance in the main document provides a simple and clear anti-corruption program, which is recommended as a minimum standard for private sector organisations to comply with if they wish to enter into public sector contracts over a reasonable value threshold. Another key question, what are the sources of the benchmarks? The benchmarks are largely based on key published and recognised national and international sources. These are referenced in detail in the guidance section. The sources are wide-ranging, and the international sources include, for example, the UNODC, of course, other United Nations agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO, the European Union, the Jakarta Statement on Principles for Anti-Corruption Agencies, many Commonwealth partner organisations, the OSCE, the International Standards Organisation, and the International Chamber of Commerce. To ensure that the benchmarks are easily usable, the benchmarks only summarise key aspects of these sources and do not attempt to replicate them in full. In cases where there's no recognised international good practice, the benchmarks propose a good practice measure, sometimes drawing from national experience. The benchmarks therefore provide a core set of measures consistent with, but often expanding upon, existing international standards. Next slide, please, Mina. What is the structure of the benchmarks? For ease of use and so as to avoid unnecessary repetition or duplication between anti-corruption measures, the 25 benchmarks have been structured on a modular basis. So you'll see 25 benchmarks there, they're kind of grouped roughly into different modules. The intention, the modules also cross-refer to each other, so all 25 benchmarks refer to each other. The intention is that each benchmark should be read with the particular guidance for that benchmark. The guidance section provides a brief explanation of the purpose of the benchmark, explains what the various provisions are intended to do, and references published good practice. So the overall scheme of the benchmarks is as follows. It's a really large document, over 500 pages, so I'm going to race you through it. The overall scheme is as follows. 1, to establish the types of corrupt conduct in the public and private sectors that should be criminalised and to recommend provisions for jurisdiction, liability, sanctions and remedies. To provide for a body or bodies with overall responsibility for developing and establishing national anti-corruption policies and practices. to ensure that those institutions which are responsible for applying and enforcing anti-corruption law and for legislating and holding the executive to account are sufficiently competent and independent to do so and are themselves free from corruption. To ensure that there's adequate anti-corruption regulation in relation to those activities which impact on the public or which could cause harm to the public. To ensure that all public sector organisations are subject to adequate anti-corruption controls. To ensure that all public officials are subject to measures that promote integrity, to ensure that there are reliable, accessible and properly advertised systems which enable corruption to be reported, to ensure that proper anti-corruption training is provided to all public officials, to promote the development and implementation of national and international standards which are designed to ensure better compliance, to encourage and enable professional institutions and business associations to play a proactive role in combating corruption by developing and implementing codes of conduct, to ensure there is transparency in relation to all public functions, to ensure that the public is freely able to participate in, report on, comment on, and lawfully protest against government, to ensure international cooperation in relation to the prevention of corruption, and to ensure that those private sector organisations which carry out public sector work are subject to adequate anti-corruption measures. Next slide, please, Mina. So as for what's next, the benchmarks after a multi-year period of consultation with experts from around the world, as I said, were published last month in April. The intention was to bring the benchmarks to the attention of Commonwealth heads of government at their biennial meeting, which was supposed to take place in Rwanda in June this year. This meeting was actually postponed from the year before due to the pandemic. And this month it was announced that it will be postponed again to an unknown date in 2022. So that means we're unable to get an endorsement in the communique from heads of government this year, but we'll be seeking that next year. In the meantime, the benchmarks, of course, are published, and we are keen to work with any of our country partners who are willing to implement the benchmarks and embark on legislative change as required. And we'll be reaching out to countries and willing partners to do that. We're also very excited to disseminate the benchmarks among the international community at large and to receive feedback. And we'd love to hear from anyone, an academic, a government official, a citizen who's interested in the benchmarks and would like to measure their own country against them and see if that can be something which can drive reform there. And I'm going to finish with a plug. Another webinar, of course, but on Wednesday, the 2nd of June, there will be a webinar devoted to the benchmarks where excellent speakers will speak about it in a much more interesting way than I have done. And I urge everyone to join. If you email me, you can see my email there. I'll be delighted to send you the registration information, or you can contact the organisers of this event and they will provide my details to you. And I hope to see some of you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Matt, and thank you for keeping also very tightly to time. You having revealed my interest in the benchmarks, I'm not sure I should now be commenting on them, but your presentation was indeed fascinating, and I think there's some really, really innovative elements in those around the concession management, around standards and certification, the role of professional institutions and business associations that really push the boundaries on what a whole anti-corruption system should look like. So I'm sure participants will have further questions on those. Thank you, Matt. As we move to our next speaker, allow me to introduce Dr. Roxana Bratu. She is a lecturer in corruption analysis at the University of Sussex. Roxana holds a PhD in sociology from LSE, an MSc and a BSc in sociology from the University of Bucharest, Romania. Before working on her PhD, she was a visiting fellow at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford. Her presentation title is Measuring Corruption, the Necessity to Find a Variety of Measures to Capture Unethical Conduct. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Dr. Bratu, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I feel that my colleagues have done such a great job. They're really tough acts to follow, so please bear with me. But today I aim to place the measuring of corruption within a wider context. So we can move to the next slide, please, Mina. So I'm going to start by talking about why is it so important to measure corruption? Well, our contemporary anti-corruption paradigm is actually based on three key assumptions. One of them is that corruption can be defined, and that's essentially conceptualizing corruption. On the basis of this definition, we assume that we can measure corruption, and on the basis of the definitions and measurements, we can assume that we can create policies that control or curb corruption. Now, the definition of corruption is actually where everything starts, because the classical definition that we use these days is that corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. Now, as most of you would know, the definition of corruption has changed over time, has become a bit more refined. But it's still based on some assumptions. And I'm just going to mention a few of these assumptions here. One of them is that we would have a clear distinction between public and private. This distinction actually doesn't hold everywhere in the world. A second key assumption of this definition is the relevance of the principal-agent model of corruption. This assumption that we would have a space in which principals would be principled and the agents would be directly engaged in corruption doesn't really hold in all sorts of environments. And the last assumption that I want to touch upon is the fact that this definition of corruption actually excludes the normative doctrine. It's based on the normative doctrine as opposed to the double-edged reciprocity-based concepts of patrimonialism, patronage, or clientelism, which in most cases would guide our unethical behavior, if not corrupt, at least unethical behavior. So, we know, or we think we know, what is the definition of corruption. But let's see now how successful have we been in actually measuring corruption based on this definition. I think we can move to the next slide. So far, we've been quite successful. And even though there is no universal measure of corruption, attempts to quantify its various dimensions and to compare across spaces, countries, have actually become omnipresent. Some of the key ways of measuring corruption, some of our key measurements are actually based on perceptions. And you're not supposed to read the pictures that I put there, but I'm guessing you are very familiar with them. So I put there the Corruption Perception Index created by Transparency International, which has become one of the most emblematic, iconic ways of measuring corruption. And then I put the beeps on the other side. So we have a number of ways of measuring corruption, like I said, based on perceptions, most of them. But we also have experience-based measurements. We also have proxy indicators. And a lot of the indicators that we have today are actually composite indexes. I would like to spend a little bit of time on the proxy measures. These are particularly interesting ways of measuring corruption. I'm just going to mention two of them. Probably you are familiar with public expenditure tracking surveys, which trace cases in which public money has either not ended up where it should have ended up or actually cannot be accounted for at all. So this type of surveys are actually very effective in identifying delays in financial and in-kind transfer, leakage rates, and general inefficiencies in the public spending. How much of that is actual corruption? That's debatable. But as I said, this is a proxy indicator. There are more sort of recent ways of measuring risks of corruption in various sectors. So, for example, our colleagues Mishi Fadzekash and Liz David Barrett have come up with good proxy indicators for corruption based on what they call objective and not subjective data, which are contract level big data on procurement processes and procurement outcomes. We can move to the next slide, please. So, we have a multitude of ways of measuring corruption, and yet it's still very, very challenging to measure it. So why is that? First of all, because of what we measure, and that's usually perceptions or attitudes and rarely experiences, and how we measure them. So we're very ambitious. We try to give a comparative figure for a very complex phenomenon. Sometimes the methodologies that we use are not the greatest, especially for composite indexes. Sources are, in a lot of cases, not independent from each other. There is no comparability within the same index between countries or within the same index over time, and that's something to bear in mind. We also know one of our current frustrations, especially in academia, is that, and in policy area, is that different measurements indicate different levels of corruption. And that's a fundamental frustration, because if we have different measurements that indicate different levels of corruption, we never know how successful we've been in terms of tackling corruption. We never know if our policies have actually made a difference or not. There is also a potential bias linked to cultural background, and also there might be lack of cultural understanding of the context for residents or expats. Which is why, for all these reasons, and we can move to the next slide, I think it's important to start looking at things that go maybe below the level of corruption. So maybe measuring hidden corruption, such as informality. Aliona Ledeneva from UCL said that informality is a term that has a history rather than a definition. So informality actually refers to the world's open secrets, unwritten rules, hidden practices, ways of getting things done. So, for example, Natalia was referring to informal practices when she was talking about the old boys network. We can see that informality has become more and more prominent on the agenda of measuring on our agenda of measuring corruption. Why do I say that? Well, because, for example, in 2013, the Global Corruption Barometer had started already to introduce questions about measuring informality. So they were measuring how important were personal contacts and relationships to get things done in the public sector. And we can see, I've put the questions there, and we can see that more than 70% of the population considered contacts as the way forward, a way to get, the best way to get things done. To what extent is the country's government run by a few big interests looking out for themselves? Again, more than 70% of the population thought the same. More recently, the Global Corruption Barometer for Middle East and North Africa in 2019 asked people from Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine about their experiences with VASTA, which is an informal way of doing things. Essentially, VASTA, like connections in English, is an economy of favors. I do you a favor, you do me a favor, and this is usually not captured by any sort of statistics. The results are very interesting. Essentially, more than 1/3 of the people interviewed used personal connections to get things done. More than 1 in 3 people who used the public service in the previous 12 months had used VASTA. So they had actually relied more on their personal networks than they had relied on the state. And the most interesting finding for me is that utilities and courts have the highest use of VASTA, which again is very interesting. These are supposed to be open access services for everyone involved. And we can move to the next slide, please. Moving beyond measuring informality, I think another idea is to actually focus on measuring integrity. So there are 2 ways that I like to signal as potential ways forward in measuring corruption. One is measuring what's below corruption, unethical behavior. The other one is to measure what's above corruption, which is virtuous behavior. So essentially, measuring integrity. And again, pretty recently, there have been attempts to create measurements of corruption. Again, Fazekas and his team have created a measure of integrity in public procurement as a composite index, taking into account more objective data, so to speak, such as single bidder contract, call for tender publication, procedure type, and so on. And then Alina Mungiu PPD has also created an index of public integrity, which has these 6 big components: judicial independence, administrative burden, trade openness, budget transparency, e-citizenship, and freedom of the press. We can move to the final slide just to wrap up my presentation. Thank you. So in conclusion, what I would like to signal is the fact that contemporary measures of corruption, as you all know, are unable to capture the real level of corruption, whatever real means. That's why I put it between inverted commas. Also, the contemporary measurements of corruption are unable to capture change or progress in the anti-corruption fight. And that's actually very, very important. And in order to improve our measurements, we could look at phenomena that escape the classical understanding of corruption and maybe move beyond the nation state, because we know that corruption doesn't stop at a border, even though our anti-corruption tools might do so. Last but not least, it's one thing that I haven't put on my slides, but I would like to just to throw it out for the conversation maybe afterwards. It might be worth thinking how technology is impacting on our ways of experiencing and measuring corruption. We live in a world of social media. Even now, we are doing this webinar on the internet. So how does this change our ways of practicing corruption and measuring it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roxana, for that fascinating presentation. And I'm really struck by a number of points, including the way that our assumptions and definitions themselves impact on how we perceive and measure corruption. And I'm also fascinated by the notion of measuring integrity and how that relates to existing anti-corruption measures. A really good food for thought. So thank you so much for your presentation. Let's move quickly to our last presentation by Salomé Flores. Salomé is head of the UNODC INEHI Centre for Excellence and its programme to prevent and counter corruption. The Centre of Excellence for Statistical Information on Government Crime, Victimisation and Justice was created in 2010 as a joint initiative of UNODC and the National Institute of Statistics of Mexico. Its main objective is to strengthen statistical, analytical and monitoring capacities. Salomé's presentation title is The Development of a Comprehensive Framework on Corruption Measurement, which I hope nicely brings together the existing presentations that we've already had. Salomé, you have the floor. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good evening, good morning to those that are on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Thank you very much to HEUNI for the invitation. I think this has been a very interesting and also kind of inspiring panel for all of us that are interested in doing some progress in measuring corruption. I think you already mentioned, actually all of you already mentioned some of the points that I'm going to show you in my presentation, but like you said, this is kind of the final wrapping up of this discussion. So next one, please, Mina. So we do have a mandate. I mean, all countries have a mandate to measure corruption. According to the UN Convention Against Corruption, all countries should be able to collect, exchange, and analyze information on corruption. Not so many countries are doing so, but Article 65 in the convention have this broad mandate, and I guess some countries have made some progress like the UK. Other countries are starting to do some progress, and of course there is a big community interested in really identify which indicators are the most relevant. I mean, not only to comply with this mandate, but to really understand the phenomena and of course to solve it. Next one, please. Because of that article and because of the 2030 agenda, you know that the international community agreed in including a target in this 2030 agenda for reducing corruption and bribery in all its forms. And as part of that target, or to measure that target, there were 2 indicators that were defined. UNODC is the custodian agency of these indicators, which means we were mandated with developing a methodology so countries could measure these indicators in a comparable way. So UNODC, with a group of experts, developed this manual on corruption surveys. The manual is available in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Russian. You can use the QR code if you want to see it and download it from our website. So basically, this indicator measures, goes beyond perception and tries to measure experience of bribery between governments and population, and between governments, population and businesses and governments. So we have the methodology, and we have some countries that are already measuring these 2 indicators. But of course, like all the previous speakers mentioned, it's good to have some indicators that are comparable, that are high quality, but this is not enough, right? So next one, please. In this slide, you can see that there are over 20 countries already measuring at least the indicator on experience of bribery between population and government. And there is some information there, but we need so much more information. And one point that I really want to make is that we are all familiarized with the perception index, and it is very good to understand the ranking that is published each year. But really having this measurement is not providing information to understand the levels of corruption and to understand the effectiveness of anti-corruption policy. So there is a huge need to go beyond perception so we can really inform policy efforts. Next one, please. So we not only have the mandate of the convention. Last year in 2019, during the meeting of the Conference of State Parties that have signed the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, there was a mandate, a new resolution that encourages the states to conduct these surveys based on the manual, but also mandates UNODC to go beyond measurement of perception and experience, and gave us the challenging mandate of developing a comprehensive framework to measure corruption. And this is the huge task that we have ahead. Next one, please. We have started by reviewing some, let's say, best practices or existing practices out there in different countries, in different continents. We have a report on that also available in English and Spanish. And what we were trying to understand in that report, first of all, was who has comprehensive anti-corruption policies and how are they measuring these anti-corruption policies, and also which countries were already trying to measure corruption levels. So you will find lots of examples in this report about indicators that are being used regarding the public sector activities and regarding more like the performance of the public sector. But this is just the starting point, and now we have this huge challenge ahead of creating this comprehensive framework. So where do we start? Next one, please. We have some preliminary findings, and I don't think I'm going to go into these ones because you already know we don't have comparable data. We don't have data of quality that is collected periodically. There are many challenges still on the conceptual side. Perhaps there are isolated efforts, but we really don't have like sustainable efforts that are comparable. And this is what we want to do in this task force. And I only have a few minutes, so please, next one, please. So we are starting to launch a task force, a new task force to develop this holistic approach, and actually reviewing some areas and sectors that are key according to the UN Convention. Of course, one of the main areas to review are the chapters of the convention, I mean, the preventive measures, and other relevant chapters like, well, international cooperation, asset recovery, and this sort of thing. And the idea is to understand really crimes, I mean, conducts that are associated to corruption, that are a number of conducts. So levels, I mean, crimes and the levels of these crimes, also to understand risks and vulnerabilities in specific sectors, and also trying to identify key indicators, like I said, to measure anti-corruption policies. Now, we are moving beyond survey data. I think Natalia already mentioned this. Survey data is very useful, but we need more data. We need other, let's say, complementary sources like qualitative data. And also, and I think Roxana already mentioned this, information coming from technology, and information also coming from yeah, like, for example, administrative records, but not the traditional ones, more like, let's say, court case files, or records on corruption offenses. And yeah, I think I ran out of time and I'm trying to run, but just next one, please. Just to say that it was very timely for us to be able to have this participation today in this panel, because in UNODC, we're about to launch this second task force for corruption measurement. We are sending invites out, so I hope that some of the experts that were here in this discussion today will join us in this task force. And the idea at the end will be to produce these guidelines so countries can really use them to produce information that is comparable, you know, across the world. And it's a huge challenge, but we believe that from the UNODC perspective, it would be very useful to produce these guidelines so countries can really use them and try to adopt them and produce this data. But I think also, just my final thought, like Natalia already mentioned, it's key to have resources in order to collect this data and disseminate it at some point. And again, thank you very much for this invite, and looking forward to see you in this task force on corruption measurement. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Salomé. Thank you for the fascinating presentation, for reminding us that there is already, in a sense, some common indicators under the SDG targets that countries should be looking to measure, but also how to bring together this holistic approach using this broad range of data sources and methods. And we're looking forward to seeing what the guidelines come up with in that respect. So we've put a call out for any questions for panelists in the chat. There's none come in yet, so perhaps I'll just use a chair's privilege to ask a first question. Sorry, one has come in. I'll wrap that one in as well. And maybe Salomé can answer the question on more information on the task force on corruption measurement in the chat. As a sort of broader question for all the panelists, I'd be really interested to know, how do you think we can move from the measurement to actually policy design? So how can we use the many different measures with all of the pitfalls that we've identified to help tell us what actually works and what a country should be doing to address a corruption problem which might be identified through those measurements? So how do we move from measurement to policy design? Maybe we could start with Natalia and then just work our way along the panelists if they want to give us their thoughts on that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to all the other panelists for really interesting presentations. That's a really hard question. I think I'll try to be very quick and very simple. I think, first of all, we need to measure, and I think that's still a problem, that it's not sufficiently measured, and the various dimensions of corruption are not sufficiently measured. I think then, secondly, if you measure, either we need to have follow-up data or kind of repeated data so that we see how the trends are shifting. And then thirdly, that information needs to feed into then actual targeted policies and practices. So we can't just measure and then do nothing. We need to then actually address those areas where we see that there are issues. And that, of course, then might require political prioritization and, as Salomé also reiterated, funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Really helpful. Matt, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, given that the benchmarks look at systems.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so something that we've tried to do with the benchmarks is that they are, in a sense, a diagnostic tool in that you can apply the benchmarks to what's already out there in your legislative landscape, and it will tell you what's missing. So it's really practical in that sense, and it will then to meet the benchmark, it'll list the concrete steps that you have to do. So the policy, so both the kind of diagnostic element and the policy response are contained in the benchmarks. It's very clear what you need to do to meet each benchmark. It was really designed to be very practical in that sense. But your other point is, of course, very, very important, that we're going to need to gather in evidence as we implement the benchmarks and work with countries about how the implementation works and what actual practices we're uncovering and where we're meeting resistance and what the practical effects of that is in the culture and the economy as a whole after the benchmark is implemented. So ongoing measurement. I mean, as Natalia said, a challenge is going to be not to just measure at one point in time, but to continue to measure, and that's something that we will have to work on in the implementation phase.
Yes, fully agree, and I like your emphasis on the ongoing process. No, thank you, Matt. Roxana, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. So in classical political science theory, the cycle of policy design is actually starting from, like Matthew was saying, from diagnosing the problem. And I think in this sense, weirdly enough, our perception surveys might be very useful, because perception actually points to kind of like areas that that we need to focus on, essentially. And then the next thing is to focus on those areas, create indicators, compliance, risk indicators, and then essentially create policies. And then we need to go back and create more refined ways of measuring to see not only if we have achieved the benchmark, or if we complied with the policies or the regulations. We need to see what challenges the policies have created in that particular sector. And that's why we need a continuous cycle to measure, create policies, measure, refine our instruments of measurement, and then refine our policy instrument. Because otherwise we're never going to know if we're successful. Because as we all know, perception never stops. The more we talk about corruption, the more perception we have.
Great, thank you, Roxana, for highlighting the cycle. Absolutely. Salomé, any last thoughts on that question from you?
Well, I think that one of the first challenges that we've found is that not many countries have like comprehensive anti-corruption policies, and the ones that do have it, they kind of have different priorities. So it's very challenging to like present a set of policies that everyone should have. But I guess yeah, it is an opportunity to at least come to an agreement of, for example, working together in measuring prevention policies. And I guess that would be a very good starting point for everyone. And I think the work that you have developed in the UK would be very interesting to see in detail, because I guess we can really get some inspiration from this work in the benchmarks that perhaps we can also adopt as part of the guidelines that will be developed in the framework of this task force on measuring corruption. But yeah, I think these are my thoughts.
Super, thank you very much, Salomé. I think we are really running out of time now. Unfortunately, it's been a fascinating discussion. My huge thanks to the panelists, all of whom have really brought to life this topic for us. If I may, a few sort of key messages that I think are coming out of this seminar, I think, to really address corruption. Of course, that all of the panelists have underlined that it's important to know the forms and extent of the phenomenon, that has to be done as a form of ongoing systematic measurement. But of course, corruption measurement is still extremely challenging, and the way in which we define it, there are underlying assumptions, the different country contexts all impact on that. And I think there's still more work to do, as our panelists have highlighted, on drawing together common understandings and measurement methodologies. It's also very clear that corruption itself is multifaceted. It includes hidden and structural corruption at many different levels. And I was particularly taken by Roxana's characterization of below and above corruption in terms of unethical behavior and integrity measurement. And I think that offers a lot of opportunities for us to further the debate and look at new and innovative ways. In sum, there's many possibilities out there. Member states already have a lot of tools that they can turn to, but it's also very clear that there is a lot in the pipeline, and I'm really excited to see where this field goes in the next months and years. So thank you very much to HEUNI for organising this. Thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you, of course, to everybody who's joined us today. I really hope you've enjoyed it and wish you a very good rest of Commission week. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.